First Thessalonians chapter 4, we had come down to this section dealing with the second coming, which begins in verse 13 and actually continues through chapter 5 and verse 11. The first part of that, which we are generally fairly familiar with, is the state of the dead, which begins in 4:13 and goes through verse 18. We, at the end of our class last week, talked about a little bit about the rapture, and this is, of course, I would say the key verse for those who teach the premillennial doctrine of the rapture. They get the 1,000-year reign from Revelation 20, which it's not included there, but there's a lot of things that are not found in Revelation 20 as far as their doctrine is concerned, but they get that there. And then as far as when they talk about the rapture part of premillennialism, they come over to this passage in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18.
Another thing they use is the soul sleep. When they
We'll get to that, but yes, that is a doctrine that comes up. I'm not sure that the premillennialists hold the soul sleeping, but Jehovah's Witnesses do. There are some that I've run across in the church that hold that position. But we will talk about that as well. Paul, starting in verse 13, when he says, "But I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that ye sorrow not, even as others which have no hope." Paul had a desire for them to have knowledge concerning these matters, and specifically those who had died prior to the second coming of Christ. He wanted them to know about their situation or their state. He did not want them to sorrow over others who have no hope, because they do have hope. They were not to sorrow as those who had none. When he says, "I would not have you be ignorant, brethren," this is an expression that Paul oftentimes uses, and many times simply to start a new section of thought or to draw attention to what he's saying. There have been some through the years who jokingly have used this by saying, "I would not have you ignorant brethren." But that's not what he's saying, obviously. He doesn't want them to be without knowledge. Ignorance is simply a lack of knowledge. There are hundreds, maybe thousands, probably millions of subjects that I have no knowledge about. I am ignorant about those things. It is not an insult to people to say that they are ignorant, because it's just simply saying you do not have knowledge about this subject. There's a difference between, for example, saying that someone is ignorant and someone is stupid. The idea of being stupid is a denigrating remark, saying that they do not have the capability of learning. Ignorance very simply says they do not have the information, they have not learned that information at that time. Says nothing about their capability of learning the subject. There's probably many subjects you have no knowledge about. There's no shame in that. You just haven't studied it yet. Maybe there hadn't been that type of interest in that subject. Okay, there's a difference, though, between that and saying you don't have the capability of learning it. Well, that's an insult. Lack of ignorance, or having ignorance, and as Paul is using it, I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, is very simply saying you don't have this knowledge yet. You've not gained this knowledge, and I don't want you to remain in that state. So what is he going to do? He's going to reveal it to them. But I say he's used this many times, and I'm not going to go over these passages other than just to mention them. For example, in Romans 1:13, Romans 11:25, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 1, 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3, 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 1, and there's several others that could be mentioned, where he uses this language to introduce a subject or to draw attention to it. Here's something that is important. So Paul is going to give them the information. He's going to reveal to them the situation of those saints who have passed away prior to the second coming of Christ. There is the possibility, and it is debated back and forth. I think a lot of brethren, a lot of people accept this idea that the Thessalonians had accepted the false notion that Jesus was going to come in their lifetime. That's not to say he could not have, but that's what they were expecting. Part of that in 2 Thessalonians was apparently written to combat this specific idea, especially as we get into 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, that these things have to take place before the second coming. So, yeah, he did, and especially 2 Peter 3rd chapter, who some were denying it altogether there. And so he was reminding them of those things which they knew. But in this case, and here's the thinking that possibly was going on, Christ is going to come in our generation. If someone dies before he comes, are they going to miss their reward? I mean, they endured all these things. They obeyed the gospel. They became a Christian. They lived the Christian life. They suffered persecution, and now then they've died. What happens to them? Do they miss that reward which they were seeking, that they hoped for? They didn't know. The word asleep, or sleep, it's just the general word for someone who's gone to sleep or who is sleeping. But it's also a metaphor that's used for death 15 times in the New Testament. Now then, why? Before we go into that why, it does not, and here's where Paul was going, the doctrine of soul sleeping, that the soul sleeps at the point of death. Well, that goes back to death and what it embraces, what all it involves. When death takes place, the spirit leaves the body. Find that in James 2 and verse 26, that the body without the spirit is dead. When that spirit leaves the body, that individual dies. Now, we could probably debate a long time, when does that spirit leave? When they die. That's it. Some who hold the idea that the breath is a spirit, that goes back to a phrase that we oftentimes use when someone sneezes, real, loud sneeze, and what do we invariably hear? God bless you. Why? Because it came from, and I'm not saying the person who says it now is using it this way. I'm just saying it originated from that thought that their spirit is departing their body because of that sneeze. And so, God bless you. Or I think it's German, Gesundheit, means the same thing. But when that takes place, the spirit departs from the body, person dies. The body is being spoken of as sleeping. Now, why? Because if you look at a dead body, it gives the appearance of sleep. Now, not of sleep literally, but it gives the appearance of sleep. And thus, that is used as a metaphor for someone who has died. They are asleep. I personally don't think so. I think you're just asking God to, keep them well and to keep them safe. I guess it could be by those who would misuse it in some way, or who doesn't even believe in God and says it. So could it be? I guess it could be. Do I think so? No, I don't believe it is. What happens to the spirit?
It says in hell he lifted up his eyes. That was pretty quick. What kind of descriptive language?
So a Christian who dies, he lifts. You're talking about the rich man and Lazarus, and the term there actually, I think, is Hades, though. In Hades, he lifted up his eyes. Their spirits, we're told in Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Returns to God. Let me start opening a can of worms that for later on and for thought. What happens to the soul?
Lazarus, his name around his bosom, it says, it don't have any other words between the two, so it's like bound he was there. I didn't say bound, but you can paraphrase it.
Spirit leaves the body, and the body or the person dies. There is, and the reason I bring this up, we generally are taught that man is a triune being. That is, man is made up of body, spirit, and soul. There is the thinking, which I am more and more tending to, that man, instead of being a triune being, is a biune being. Two. Body and soul, or spirit, and those two terms, spirit and soul, being used interchangeably within the Scriptures.
God said, let us make man in our image.
And our,
God. He's spirit.
He's spirit. And so God did what? Breathed in man's nostrils the breath of life. And this goes back into a study of the original words, because spirit and soul, you have two different words in the Hebrew, even as you do in the Greek. And so which one is being used in that context? You have to find out. If you want the passage, for example, Matthew the 10th chapter, in verse 28, not to fear man, but to fear him that is able to destroy both soul, now you have soul, and body in hell. What happened to the spirit there? Where's the spirit? That's why some of those are the reasons I'm thinking more and more man is a biune being instead of a triune being. Pam?
What about the scripture dividing the soul and spirit?
Okay.
So in my mind, the soul and the spirit go together. So like in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and he was in paradise. So the consciousness was with the spirit. So in my mind, it's soul and spirit go together.
When you use,
Where goes the soul goes?
but you're saying that they're two different and distinct things,
Okay, the word fire. Yeah, I believe the word fire.
which that's fine. Most brethren do. And I have no problem with people who hold that. I just say that you have difficulty in defining terms. I ask a bunch of preachers the question, or this question, how would you define the difference between soul and spirit? I had one answer, and I asked someone else who I'd presented this to, what did he say? And he said, I have no idea. It was convoluted, because even in trying to define the difference, you go back to interchangeable words. Some just said, well, I believe in triune nature. Actually, the passage that's used more than Hebrews 4:12, that one is used. The only other passage really is here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, at the end of chapter 5, where it talks about body, soul, and spirit. So does that, those would be the two passages really that use the two terms in the same verse.
There's a verse in the New Testament that says the spirits of just man, comma, made perfect, describing what just had been said, and I forget where it's at.
I think it's in Hebrews, but I don't remember the exact passage or location, but I remember what you're talking about. But here you have the body is sleeping, or gives the appearance of sleeping. The spirit has returned to God. And that spirit is going to come, we're going to see in the following verses, with Christ when he comes. And if I were pressing the point, where's the soul? When does it come? Or does it? Or does it exist anymore?
Always say what they're supposed to make.
Well, that's that is a major point too. What difference does it make? Doesn't make a lot of difference. Because with these preachers, my first question was, was it a fellowship issue? And someone turned around, do you believe it is? I said, no, I don't believe it is. I don't believe it should be. It is an aspect of study and learning. But when we get over in chapter 5 in that body, soul, and spirit, we'll talk a little bit more about that, because I will admit at this point in time, in the past, I have stated that proves that man is a triune being. But I never changed my mind on anything, so I did on that, though, or I am changing my mind. So the spirit has returned to God who gave it. Body gives the appearance of sleep, and thus those who are asleep. He does not want them to sorrow as others who have no hope. Again, I'll go back to this idea that possibly was in Thessalonica, seems to be at least, that those who might have died prior to the second coming, they were going to be excluded from the joys of heaven. That was the end of it for them. And only those who were alive when Christ comes at the second coming would be entering into the joys of heaven. So there might have been that type of a feeling as Paul is writing this. So what would that cause? That would cause sorrow. I mean, that individual who had lived faithful to Christ, and now then he's going to miss the joys of heaven. Why? Because he died before Christ came. That would be a very sorrowful situation. There is sorrow over one who dies, whether Christian or not. Jesus, in fact, the shortest verse in the English Bible states what? Jesus wept. John the 11th chapter and verse 35. Now that was at the death of Lazarus, his friend. And whether or not Jesus was lamenting the actual death of Lazarus, the loss of a friend, or whether he was just sympathizing with or empathy with those who were grieving, so it doesn't really state. It just states the fact that Jesus wept and they were weeping and lamenting his death. In Acts the 8th chapter, in verse 2, you remember in the 7th chapter we have Stephen's powerful sermon to the Sanhedrin. What do they do with him? They take him out and stone him, right? And then it says in chapter 8 and verse 2 that devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. Great lamentation. He was a faithful Christian. Died, and there's the great lamentation over him. Okay, Dale?
Some people have speculated that with Christ's great spirituality and knowledge, that he could be thinking to himself, I'm having to bring my good friend back into the world of suffering after he already was Abraham in his bosom. Man, he might have had that confidence. He might not have said those words. He might have had that confidence.
Well, we don't know. That is another, some have speculated that, yes. Just like they have speculated that he would have been the saddest person on earth at the time. Well,
Said, wow, I gotta go back and be there, and I'm already where I am.
so, again, we're not told why, and the speculations abound. We just know the fact that Jesus wept, and that the people were in great sorrow. There, we don't know. And it doesn't really matter. There's the fact that he wept. He cried over, whether it was with this being in sympathy with those who were in sorrow, whether it was because of the loss of his friend, whether it was he was going to bring him back from paradise. We don't know. It doesn't state, but the fact that he wept. With Stephen, they made great lamentation over him. There was great sorrow over the death of Stephen by the church. They did over Dorcas in Acts the 9th chapter. Or no, that was Acts 9. The latter part of Acts the 9th chapter. So they were weeping and wailing because of the good deeds that she had done. There is grief over the death of those who are Christians. I have heard some brethren in the past saying that you shouldn't weep over the death of the Christian. Well, they did in the Scriptures. There's plenty of it. There is, though, a difference in the grief of a Christian, or the grief over the death of a Christian, and the grief of the death of one who is not a Christian. There is a great deal of difference because the Christian has hope. The non-Christian has no hope. Now, they're going to be raised, yes. And while it's not stated specifically, they will be given an immortal or an incorruptible body, but it will be a body that's going to be cast into hellfire and in eternal torment because they are without Christ and have no hope. That's phraseology of Ephesians 2 and verse 12, that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. So they have no hope while the Christian has hope. And as a result, you sorrow not as others who have no hope, because there is hope. Now then, just to keep in our minds, the non-Christian or the unfaithful Christian is not given any consideration in this passage. It just doesn't talk about him. All Paul is discussing is this one specific point. What about Christians who have died before the second coming? So the idea of non-Christians is not even under discussion. Now then, that's what is necessary in relationship to the theory of the rapture. That it has to be. 1 Corinthians 15. John the 5th chapter, verse 28 and 29 says that they will all be raised. In 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10, all stand before the judgment seat of Christ to receive the things done in his body, whether it be good or bad. So all is not exclusive of Christians in that passage, but it's everyone. Well, everyone going to be raised at the same time, and that's what John 5 teaches us. Not 1,000 years or 1,007 years between them. Now then, if you go back to chapter 1 and verse 3, Paul mentions this hope when he says, remembering without ceasing your work of faith and labor of love and patience of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ in the sight of God and our Father. So he is constantly giving them, you have hope. There's hope for the Christian. A hope of a life after death in heaven with God. And within the context of this passage, the hope that we see is of a bodily resurrection from the dead to that type of a joyous life with God. So in verse 14, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so them also which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. Now then, based upon the fact that Jesus died and rose from the grave, we have assurance of those that have passed on from this life will be brought back with him.
So that verse in Psalm 90, verse 8 or 10 or 12, over there, we die and we fly away. So it's basically the idea that when God brings people with Jesus, that you just have to read them. We like fly straight to Jesus and we'll be with him that quick. That's the idea. When you chant up in Psalms 90 and 8 or 10.
That would not refer to this.
That would not refer to this?
No. What you're talking about in Psalm 90 would be at the point of death. What happens? The spirit leaves the body. The spirit flies away from the body, and it returns to God. Ecclesiastes 12:7. Now then, that spirit that is with God, Christ is going to come or bring with him. That's the latter part of this verse that we'll get to. But the 90th Psalm would have reference to death itself and the spirit of man departing the body. Curtis Cates wrote that the two cardinal doctrines of Christianity, or there are two cardinal doctrines of Christianity, the vicarious death of Christ and the bodily resurrection of Christ. One of the major differences of Christianity with other religions is the historicity of those 2 points. That Christ died for others, the vicarious death of Christ, and the bodily resurrection of Christ. If we cannot historically establish those 2 points, Christianity falls. It's worthless. With other religious systems, you don't have that type of historicity that the religion is based upon this type of history. You take Confucianism, Taoism, Zionism, all of these others. Islam. You don't have the historicity that's there. We can, and we don't generally do this, but we can very easily prove that Jesus lived. A man named Jesus lived, who was called Christus. We can easily prove historically that he died upon the cross. And we can prove historically that the tomb was empty the third day. Now then, you can prove that by secular history, not biblical history. Obviously, you can prove it by a biblical history. And then if you just want to go into some detail about that, you then have to, because these are witnesses, you have to look at the credibility of witnesses. Can witnesses lie? I would say we see it all the time, whether witnesses lying to Congress, witnesses lying on the witness stand in a trial. You see it regularly in our society. Witnesses can lie. Can witnesses be simply mistaken? Well, sure they can. They thought something, that they saw something, and it really wasn't the case. So you have to look at the credibility of the witnesses. And when you look at the credibility of the witnesses that's found within the Bible, it's very easy to determine that those witnesses are credible. I mean, one of the great reasons for lying upon the witness stand is some type of advantage that it's going to be for the person lying. What advantage did it do to the apostles to proclaim the resurrected Christ? Wasn't any, really, was there? It was a disadvantage to them, if anything, from a well, okay, James, all of the apostles died a martyr's death with the exception of John, from what we know historically. What advantage did it do them? Didn't do them much good. And lying, if they were lying, people don't do that. You know, biggest liars in the world. The fact is, thus, when you start looking at, were they lying about it? No. Were they just simply deceived and mistaken about it? Well, again, no. What Paul mentions there in 1 Corinthians 15, over 500 people at one time. So we have proof for the historicity of Christianity. No other religion has that and can base their beliefs on that type of credible evidence. So we will start with that, Lord willing, next